The goblin yelled something loudly and swung his sword while his face showed hostility. The goblin struck the man, and scarlet blood sprayed into the air. Theodore woke up with a start, his eyes widening. The main character stood up in bed and saw that the professor was not where he had gone to bed earlier. Theodore threw his cloak over himself and looked out of the carriage, calling for Vince. Suddenly the main character looked at something in shock. He saw the forest fill with thick red flames. Theodore frowned and assumed they were under attack. The main character concluded that Vince went to fight, and the young man faintly sensed the enemy energy, so he could not understand where it was. Theodore clenched his fist, and fragments of earth appeared nearby. The main character got down on one knee and ordered Mithra to crawl into the ground to find out what was happening here. Seeing an explosion nearby, Theodore loudly called the professor. The main character closed his eyes, thinking that he could only use visualization at a limited distance, but could detect the enemy by the waves from the ore veins. Suddenly Theodore opened his eyes wide and froze, covered in drops of sweat. The main character came to the conclusion with horror that these were the goblin elite, and judging by their equipment, these were hobgoblins. The hobgoblin with red skin and white eyes smiled widely. Theodore screamed deafeningly that they had been discovered. An army of hobgoblins headed towards the main character. Theodore, standing in front of the carriage, did not understand that how the goblins learned to move unhindered underground. A goblin in yellow clothes shouted something with a grin, holding a crossbow in his hands. The arrow shot forward with lightning speed. Theodore, grabbing Mithras, jumped away from the attacks that hit the carriage. The main character fell to the ground and found himself right in front of a goblin in metal armor. Theodore froze in fear when the goblin swung his sharp dagger with a deafening roar. The protagonist quietly ordered Mithra to create confusion to confuse them. While Theodore sat holding Mithra close to him, sharp stakes suddenly grew out of the ground, piercing the bodies of the goblins and lifting them up. Sitting in the middle of an empty space, the main character thought that there were too many enemies, and besides, he did not expect that he would have to hide with Mithra. While the smoke filled everything around him, Theodore thought that he had used too much energy the day before and that his strength was running low. Jake, whose face was twisted with anger, first spoke in goblin language and then switched to human. The goblin, holding a weapon in both hands, jumped towards Theodore. The main character, grinning with tension, waved his hand, and the earth rose in the air in front of him. Jake jumped on the main character at the exact moment when an earthen wall formed in front of Theodore's face. The sand rose above Theodore as he watched the goblin jump higher. Jake landed on the ground. The goblin said that he saw the same magician as the one he met before the main character. The goblin frowned aggressively and wrinkled his nose, looking at Theodore with eyes burning with hatred and calling him a brat. Jake, dressed in red armor, held a dagger in his hand in front of him and looked at Theodore with a grin. He asked if he was a magician. Theodore, who managed to raise his hand and use the earth spell to protect himself, was in shock and did not understand what was happening. Jake raised the dagger in his hand to eye level, continuing to look at Theodore. He came to the conclusion that Theodore was weaker than ordinary magicians. Theodore, with spikes protruding around him, looked at the leader of the hobgoblins standing opposite. Theodore watched as Jay lowered his blades, and dark mana began to swirl around him. Theodore was unable to determine his ability, and it was not so easy to recast the spell. Theodore watched carefully as Jake raised his hand with a sword made of dark energy. He studied every movement of his enemy, because if he attacks without calculating his actions, then nothing will work out and Theodore will exhaust himself to death. Jake ran with his blades at Theodore. Theodore tilted his body in anticipation. He extended his hand from which Glutton appeared with his tongue hanging out. The Glutton smiled and laughed. He asked Theodore if he had offered him some fun. As Jake's blades pierced Theodore's body, his body turned to sand and began to float in the wind. Jake looked at the place where he had just swung his blade. He did not understand how Theodore disappeared or whether he used resonance. Jake looked up at where Theodore had appeared. Theodore found himself in the air above Jake, Glutton in his left hand preparing a lightning spell. Jake raised his head up and looked at Theodore. Theodore straightened his arms. A lightning spell gathered at the tip of his fingers. Theodore pointed at Jake with his fingers, directing the spell at him. Jake smiled, looking at Theodore. He was interested in his actions. A huge ball of lightning gathered in front of Theodore. Circles of mana flashed in the air. Jake ducked in preparation to dodge the spell. Theodore looked down, his face illuminated by the light from the lightning spell. Looking at Theodore, Jake laughed. The lightning missile hit the ground. A huge explosion was caused by the lightning spell colliding with the ground, fragments of the ground flying in all directions. Theodore frowned and decided not to prolong the fight and finish it. Suddenly, Jake appeared in the air behind Theodore in a puff of red smoke, swinging his leg to kick Theodore. Theodore noticed Jake with his gaze. He looked at him in fear, suspecting that he had used teleportation magic. Jake kicked Theodore in the face in the air, sending him down. Jake smiled predatorily, laughing at Theodore's stupidity. From Jake's kick, Theodore's body spun in the air. Theodore rolled on the ground, an expression of pain frozen on his face. When Theodore's body stopped crashing into the ground, Jake landed and softened the landing with his hands in a crouch. Jake stood up in half a circle and crossed his arms. He asked Theodore if this was all he was capable of, because he was thinking about having fun with Theodore longer. With blood running down the right side of Theodore's face, he asked Jake in a hoarse voice how the hobgoblin could speak human language and use magic. Jake looked down at Theodore. He told him that everything was thanks to the slaves that the mountain bandits sold to them. Prisoners of war were easy to obtain after killing squads in wars, and demons were no exception. There was no greater humiliation for an enemy than becoming a slave. The goblins had a female magician in their slavery who taught them everything. People were easy to control if they were brainwashed. Of all the goblins, only the great progenitor was able to sense mana. Therefore, having studied all the necessary skills, Jake became a warrior. Smiling broadly, he told Theodore how useless slaves were given over to be torn to pieces by the lower goblins. Theodore, who was still bleeding, asked if the magician woman was alive. Jake again summoned his blades. He stood in front of Theodore and asked not to worry about her, because soon Theodore would also become a slave. Other goblins appeared behind Jake, who was standing. Jake threatened Theodore. He said that in the end he would tear out his heart and sell him on some black market. Jake looked down on Theodore. He was going to tie Theodore up. Theodore began to stand up, blood flowing down his forehead. Theodore opened his palm. Half of his palm was covered in blood. Theodore looked at Jake in rage. He threatened to kill Jake and as many of his henchmen as possible. Hearing his words, Jake became angry, and the other goblins began to laugh. Theodore raised his hand and began to stand up. His hand glowed due to the magic of light. Thanks to the rest, he could now use magic. A bright light radiated from Theodore. The entire area was illuminated with light. Jake covered his eyes with his hand from the light. He was unpleasant that he did not see Theodore. Instantly, Theodore appeared next to Gian, swinging a glowing fist. He was aiming at Jake's face. Standing next to Jake, Theodore, whose hair was developing from the flow of wind and mana, said that he had in his hand a means to kill them all. Theodore was behind Jake in an instant. Theodore's fist tore apart Jake's head. The magic of the flash glowed in his fist. Theodore looked at the goblins with his hand outstretched. The very next second, Theodore walked past some goblins and tore their heads open with his fist. Theodore lowered his fist, which continued to glow with magic. Theodore stood in a victorious pose, and behind him, the bodies of goblins, deprived of their heads, began to fall. The rest of the goblins, who were watching everything from the side, got scared and began to get nervous. The veins around Theodore's eyes and forehead bulged as he glared at the goblins. In an instant, Theodore, with a raised and glowing fist, found himself in front of one of the goblins. The goblin opened his mouth in fear. The huge explosion of light from Theodore's strike was visible even through the huge trees and foliage. Vince's ear caught the vibration and sound of Theodore's spell. Vince turned his head towards the explosion, suspecting the use of a fire flash spell. Vince turned his head to Anna, who was talking to a worker in an apron, and asked her to report on the situation. Anna stretched out and stood up like a soldier. She told about the situation, saying that due to the fire everything was burned, but the losses were small. They lost contact with the cart and the tail, so she couldn't say anything about it. Vince, who was looking at her, swore. He still heard the sound of the explosion. He asked Anna to keep an eye on everything here, and he would return and look at what happened in the distance. Vince went to the carts, next to which the mercenaries were standing. He ordered them to return. Sweat ran down Theodore's face. He was tired and barely breathing. Huge clouds of dust and earth rose in front of Theodore, blocking his view. Theodore fell to his knees and rested his hand on his knee. He could not move due to fatigue. The sweat continued to flow from Theodore's face as he wondered in his mind if he was really going to die now. A goblin figure appeared in the smoke in front of Theodore, who was kneeling. Theodore's face twisted with rage. He cursed everything because of the newanime. A goblin with red tattoos in the middle of his forehead and 2 tattoos crossing his eyes. The goblin smilingly asked how Theodore dared to kill Jake, the leader of the hobgoblins. He ordered Theodore to get up and fight him. At this time, Vince whispered with his mouth open, ordering Theodore not to dare die. The red hobgoblin stood in front of Theodore, pointing his red blade at Theodore. Theodore raised his head. He looked at the goblin, who appeared with fatigue, steam coming out of his mouth. The goblin's red eyes looked at Theodore. He said that he was seething with anger over the murder of Jake. Theodore's tired eyes looked at the goblin and asked what this had to do with him. The goblin's lips curved into a smile. It was important for him to defeat Theodore. As the goblin and Theodore were talking, the figure of Mithras emerged from the ground. The goblin kept ordering Theodore to stand up, but suddenly turned his head in the other direction. The goblin's feet sank into the ground. He looked down at his feet, around which the earth began to rise, blocking his path. The goblin looked at Theodore with fury. He was angry at the magician who stooped to cheap tricks. Theodore looked at what was happening in shock. He had not yet restored his mana, and casting spells took time. He did not understand who was using the magic. Theodore turned his head back a little and noticed Mithra flying towards him. He asked her about her condition. Looking at Mithra's outstretched arms, Theodore realized that she had collected all the magical energy to prolong the call and bind the enemy. From Theodore's hand, which he was leaning on the ground, a white stream of mana, similar to steam, began to flow. Theodore stood up and clenched his fist, gathering mana around him. Theodore got into a dashing stance, preparing to kill his latest enemy. Theodore glared at the goblin as the flash spell in his fist glowed brightly. The moment he approached the goblin, his fist flying towards him, the goblin immediately began to raise his red blade to block Theodore's attack. Theodore's fist shattered the goblin's sword and headed towards the goblin's body. Theodore leaned towards the goblin's side and punched him in the torso, breaking the goblin's stone armor. The goblin, from whose mouth blood had escaped and whose armor had been destroyed, raised his hand under which Theodore's head was located. Gritting his teeth, the goblin found the moment to counterattack. Theodore looked at the goblin from the side, wondering why his blow didn't penetrate the goblin's body. A second later, Theodore's pupils shrank and the capillaries in his right eye became visible due to pain. The goblin grabbed Theodore's neck and kicked him in the torso with his knee. The blow made Theodore's mouth open in pain. Theodore's whole body trembled in pain. The goblin did not let go of him, continuing to hold him in his grip. The goblin lifted Theodore's body in preparation to knock it over. When his body was in the air, Theodore cursed the goblin. He had little mana to cast counterattack spells. His mind needed more time. Even Mithra disappeared. The goblin grabbed the clothes on Theodore's torso and began to fall backwards. Theodore clenched his teeth and cast a levitation spell. The body of the goblin and Theodore froze in the air. The smoke from the recent battle between Theodore and Jake cleared due to Theodore's spell. Theodore and the goblin's body floated a few centimeters from the ground. The goblin was in shock. Floating with his body upside down, Theodore cast a control spell. Theodore's body flew out of the goblin's grip, causing gusts of wind in its path. He flipped over and landed on his feet, sliding along the ground. Theodore looked at the goblin. His mind managed to break the distance. He wanted to wait until his mana was restored and then kill the goblin with one blow. The arrow flew past Theodore's head, ruffling his hair. Theodore was surprised and looked at the goblin in shock. A goblin in the distance was lifting a spear stuck into the ground. He used it as a throwing weapon. His endurance surprised Theodore. The goblin raised his hand behind his back, swinging for a throw. With a furious face, he threw a spear with a sharp tip at Theodore. The spear raised dust and gusts of wind on its way to Theodore. Theodore himself touched the ground with his hands and looked at the approaching spear. Theodore's pupils shrank again. He had no time to restore his mana. Running away would not save him. He could not believe that he would die at the hands of such a non-entity. Theodore stretched his head forward and looked at the enemy opposite. The glutton on Theodore's left hand called out to him. Opening his mouth, Glutton asked Theodore if this was the end. Theodore calmly listened to the glutton, who said that he would die faster than others. Theodore clenched his jaw out of rage, refusing to die. He touched his fingers to the ground, preparing to cast an earth spell. Theodore was going to get out of here alive. A huge stone wall appeared in front of Theodore, protecting him from the spear. Due to using a large amount of mana to the limit, Theodore felt enormous pain and lost consciousness from the pain for a short moment. The spear pierced most of the stone wall and only at the end changed its trajectory. Bouncing upward, this saved Theodore, who was already lying behind the wall. Theodore directed his hand by extending 2 fingers on it. He began to aim while looking at the clouds of smoke. This time he was not going to miss. Mana began to collect in Theodore's fingertip, and one of Theodore's eyes was filled with blood, making it difficult to aim. Theodore fired a magical missile, dispersing all the smoke in its path. The goblin in the distance only noticed the attack. The magic missile pierced the goblin's arms exposed as a shield and hit the goblin's head, throwing his head back, the goblin's legs sliding along the ground trying to stop his fall. A gap appeared in the goblin's teeth. He smiled wildly with his head thrown back. Theodore stood with his finger pointed at the goblin, realizing that he had spent all his strength. Theodore's body began to fall to the ground, his strength not being enough to kill the goblin. The red-skinned goblin watched as Theodore fell to the ground. Part of the goblin's nose fell off due to Theodore's previous attack. He smiled contentedly with the battle. The goblin raised his missing middle finger and rubbed his nose. Continuing to rub his nose, his bald head became visible from his back due to the lowered hood. He imagined himself as a real leader. The goblin raised his hand and looked at the missing finger. The goblin was happy looking at his hand, but he noticed Vince appeared behind him and raised his hand behind him. Vince touched the goblin's shoulder with his hand. Fire began to spread from Vince's hand. Vince asked if he was sure of his victory. The goblin looked sharply in Vince's direction in shock. Vince stood nearby, preparing his magic. The goblin's body burst into flames. Vince himself began to move away from the goblin, not paying attention to his cries of pain. With the last of his strength, the goblin extended his burning hand towards the departing Vince and asked where he came from. His hand began to disappear in flames as Vince continued to move away from him. Vince began to walk towards Theodore, leaving the burnt body of the goblin behind. When Vince picked Theodore up, he woke up and opened one eye looking at the professor. Closing his eyes and being in Vince's arms, Theodore began to blame himself for weakness. The professor who was looking at him closed his eyes and said that it was not his fault and the problem was such an unstable state of the world. Rising to his feet with Theodore in his arms, Vince began to walk. Theodore turned his head and looked to the side after Vince's request to look at all the people who remained alive thanks to him. Theodore's lips curved into a satisfied smile. Blue-skinned trolls with bone clubs growled at their enemies. Mercenaries dressed in knightly armor fought with the trolls. One of them pointed his sword at them, raising their morale. Goblins, trolls, and humans fought against each other. One of the goblins jumped on a mercenary who blocked him with a sword. A man with his hair in a ponytail attacked the enemy opposite with his sword. At this time, in the carriage, Vince touched his chin with his hand and looked out the window behind the battle of the mercenaries. Crossing his arms, Vince noticed that the mercenaries were fighting more actively than usual. He wondered if the fresh troll blood was being used to make elixirs. Theodore looked out the window and asked if they should help. Vince smiled weakly and touched his chin again with his hand. He stopped Theodore by saying that if they intervene and fry the troll, they will only hear complaints in return. Anna, who suddenly appeared at the window, bowed her head and called Vince her husband. Because of her words, sweat rolled down Vince's face out of fear. Looking at Anna outside, who raised one hand, Vince asked not to call him husband. Anna, smiling, called him that again. With her hands resting on the window post, Anna praised Vince and spoke of her admiration for his battle with the goblins. Leaning over a little and looking up, Anna praised Theodore for his battle, at which time Anna's subordinate approached them with a box in his hand. Anna rested her head on her arm with her other hand pointing at Theodore. She told about the rumors where Theodore defeated the leader of the hobgoblins. Theodore excitedly recalled that it was Vince who killed him in the end. Vince, sitting opposite, smiled, reflecting on the news that had already quickly spread. Vince looked at Theodore and said that all the achievements would go to him. Theodore scratched the back of his head with his hand, smiling awkwardly and thanking Vince. Anna was indignant because they did not pay attention to her and raised both hands in protest. She was here on an important matter. After Vince asked about her case, Anna raised her hand and beckoned her subordinate with her fingers. During Anna's story, the subordinate began to open the box. Anna reported that she had prepared a gift for helping to repel the attack of the hobgoblins. In the box on a soft pad there was a blue fruit. Vince adjusted his glasses as he asked about the subject. Anna raised her finger and said that she didn't know, but she had heard that the Magic Academy was looking for this item. Vince looked at Anna, who hid her hands behind her back. He gesticulated with his hands, trying to refuse such an expensive gift. Anna began to play with her hair, explaining that this gift was just an excuse. Vince's mouth opened in surprise at her words. Anna, continuing to play with her hair with her finger, reminded Vince that she had already said earlier that her father left after preparing everything and this thing was part of his preparations. Vince breathed a sigh of relief and, looking at Anna, realized that her trade guild wanted to improve relations with the magician of the fifth circle. Vince decided to accept the gift. Anna clenched her fist victoriously. Rejoicing, she began to joke about the wedding gift, but Vince asked her to stop joking. The coachman in front of the cart controlled the horses. A huge caravan of carts followed them. In one of the carriages, Vince was bandaging his hand, and Theodore, sitting opposite, watched him. Theodore asked Vince if he knew what kind of crystal it was that Anna gave him. Vince looked at Theodore and responded by saying that he had jumped to conclusions. In fact, it was not a crystal. Vince raised his hand, gesturing to her. He began to tell Theodore about the plants that contain the blood of monsters, sometimes forming crystals of magical power in the form of a fruit. The community of the Magic Academy called these fruits monstrous fruits. They lured monsters with their scent and increased the strength of monsters who ate the fruit. There was a possibility that the hobgoblins found these fruits. Vince put his elbow on the window and, looking at Theodore, said that no one still knows how to use these fruits, but in their day, sooner or later someone will solve this problem. Vince grabbed his chin with his hand and informed Theodore about the addition to his collection. Hearing this, Theodore was not happy. He looked at Vince with a sad look. Vince, looking into the distance, noticed how their destination was already visible. Theodore, after his words, also turned his head looking into the distance. Theodore was greatly surprised by what he saw and opened his mouth. A huge spiral tower was visible in the distance. In the distance, a monumental tower rises on the horizon, its style and architecture drawing attention to its majestic presence. Rising high into the sky, the tower is crowned with a spiral building. It was the magical reign and capital of the magical kingdom of Melter, Monaville. In the capital of Monaville, 4 towers towered over the city, and in the very center there was a magic tower. Each of the towers was painted a certain color to match the 4 elements. Vince began to take out a red cloak representing the most fearless and outstanding battle magicians in the red tower. Vince elegantly threw his cloak over himself. Theodore, who was following Vince, made a conclusion, now realizing that the professor was in the red tower. Vince turned and informed Theodore that right after they passed the city gates, they were heading to the Magic Academy. A huge caravan stopped near the gate. The guards blocked their path and began a conversation with the coachman. Vince had already gotten out of the cart and was looking at the long line in front. Theodore was just getting out of the cart. Vince told how Monaville was distinguished by its strict checkpoint. Raising his finger, Vince said that they would not have to wait. Theodore behind him sadly remembered that they had an invitation. Anna and her subordinates, with whom she discussed matters, noticed the departure of Vince and Theodore. They all looked after them. Anna shouted after those leaving, asking to take them with her, but Vince waved his hand and reminded that the invitation allows the magician to see only a limited number of people. Looking at Vince, Theodore sarcastically asked about the reason for his joyful mood. Soon Theodore and Vince approached the gate. A guard dressed in white robes with a spear in his hand saluted Vince, who had an invitation in his hand. Vince extended the invitation through the small letter delivery window. The inspector brought the monocular to his eye while checking the invitation letter. The inspector spoke about Vince's personality, asking him to confirm his words. Vince, having heard information about himself, said that there were no mistakes. Vince and Theodore passed the checkpoint. Theodore turned to look at the guards saluting Vince. A few minutes later, Vince and Theodore approached the second checkpoint, where 2 guards were stationed. Walking behind, Theodore asked Vince if they could really go in. Vince raised his hand with the badge in it and told Theodore not to worry. When Vince showed his badge, the guards raised the curtains and let him through. After passing, Theodore began to look around, and Vince walked calmly with his hands in his pockets. Theodore, looking around the area, was impressed by the privileges of the magicians who received the invitation. Vince and Theodore approached a shop with a worker in a white uniform. The worker held in his hand the application for the students' participation in the tournament and asked Vince to confirm whether Theodore was really a magician of the 4th circle. The worker apologized to Vince and Theodore, who were standing in front for the illiterate question, but he needed this information for the application. Vince raised his hand with 3 outstretched fingers, saying that Theodore is a magician of the third circle. The worker looked at his hand with 3 outstretched fingers in disbelief. The worker, holding the application in his hand, awkwardly said that all participants in the tournament were magicians no lower than the 4th round. Even with a good stabilization system, still every year someone was injured, and someone even died. The worker asked to discuss his participation with the student. Suddenly, the magician of the blue tower standing nearby spoke up, saying that if this is a student under the wing of the magician of the red tower, he will survive the difference in the number of circles. A middle-aged man with a long, braided beard looked at Theodore and Vince with his blue eyes. With a distraught grin on his face, the man froze in one position. Taken aback, the main character tried to find out if Vince knew him. He, in turn, said that he was seeing him for the first time, suggesting that he had bad manners. Confused, the man noted that he did not immediately introduce himself. Bowing, he announced that he was a representative of the Blue Tower. Smirking, the man stated that they could call him Lauren. In the vastness of the city, evening was gradually approaching, which is why the rays of the setting sun enveloped the roofs of buildings. Lauren wondered if Theodore was participating in the tournament for the first time, revealing that the rules had changed a bit, which is why he came to give advice. Smirking, Lauren stated that all participants in the training tournament would receive participant tokens at the same time. Reaching out his hand, he asked if the main character said his name was Theodore, trying to find out if he had received the participant's gold medal. Looking at it, Lauren noted that this was a pass to the tournament. The main character's gaze was attracted by a medal that was swaying from side to side. With a thoughtful look, Theodore reported that his registration number was 132. An image of magicians fighting among themselves appeared in his head. Lauren said that participants demonstrate their abilities using this token, noting that the winner takes the loser's token. He snapped his fingers and declared that whoever had the most tokens would win in the end. Putting his hand to his chin, Vince noted that the rules of the tournament were different before. Lauren said that the rules had changed slightly due to the large number of participants, adding that the tournament should end by the time the main magic competition began. An image of a calendar appeared in his head. Lauren further noted that the schedule was impossible to accommodate with the league's old system. Putting his hand to his chin again, Vince assumed that, in other words, the pad had come out. Smirking, Lauren stated that it was, adding that there were those who called the old system barbaric, wondering if the winner-takes-all approach was such a bad thing. With a serious expression on his face, Vince said that he would ask another question, asking what would happen if someone fought only against the weak or avoided battles altogether, collecting as many tokens as possible. With his back to the guys, Lauren noted that it sounded funny. Smirking, he stated that this was a good question, adding that he expected this from the magician of the Red Tower, noting that they were quite good at thinking. Calling out to Mia standing behind him, Lauren asked her to come over. Looking at the guys standing next to him, Lauren asked to be allowed to introduce her, saying that this was his favorite student, the second daughter of Viscount Gluco. With an embarrassed expression on her face, Mia greeted the guys. Folding her hands, she noted that just like her mentor had said, the whole process was dragging on because the members were too busy trying to save their own skins, stating that this was the reason they decided to introduce new rules this year. Wary, Vince said that it was all too vague, asking her to get closer to the point. Laughing, Lauren stated that the new rule was that a participant with at least one token did not have the right to refuse the battle. Raising his finger, he said that this is why for someone like Theodore to be here. Continuing, he stated that he didn't think it was that bad, recounting a saying used by the magicians of the Red Tower, which says that those who act carelessly make mistakes. Placing a hand on Mia's shoulder, Lauren stated that if the guys thought it was too harsh, they would give Theodore time to prepare, noting that the date and time of the battle could be set by whoever was challenged. Wary, Vince tried to find out what the main character would do. Looking into emptiness, Theodore asked if all the work was finished for today. Putting his hand to his chin, Vince said that this was not the case, stating that he had ordered dinner at a restaurant that was under the control of the Imperial Court. Inspired, the main character said that he would like to visit there at least once, adding that in this case, they need to finish things quickly. Smirking, Theodore declared that the battle would take place right now. With a distraught look, Lauren suggested they begin. The sun rose above the place of the duel. The story tells us that the action takes place in the Pentarium. This is a multi-stadium where participants fight. The battle site was divided into many parts, each of which is an independent area, and the main hall, located in the center, will open on the last day of the tournament. Holding magical artifacts in her hands, the girl asked the participants to put on crystals. Looking at the contents in her hands, Theodore tried to find out what it was. The girl said that these are protective magic crystals that block attacks of magicians of the 4th circle and below 3 times. Approaching the surprised protagonist, she stated that each time the amulet takes an attack, 1 crystal is destroyed, noting that depending on the strength of the attack, 1 blow can destroy 2 crystals at once. Further, she said that the one whose crystals were destroyed lost. With a worried expression on his face, Theodore wondered if this was an expensive artifact. Stating that this is not so, the girl said that it is disposable, which is why it is not at all expensive, suggesting that it costs a couple of gold pieces. From what he heard, the protagonist's face was shrouded in annoyance. Holding the tablet in her hands, Mia tried to find out if Theodore was from a noble family, noting the face he made when he heard about the pair of gold coins. Mia suggested that judging by his reaction, he was just the son of a baron. Outraged, Theodore said that for starters, she didn't need to put gum behind her ear, noting that she should just throw it away. Mia said that this is not what the main character thought, adding that this is a feature of the Gluco family. Trying to calm down the angry guys, the girl announced that they would fight during the match. Sitting in the stands, their mentors awaited the start of the match. Clenching his fist, the main character prepared for battle. The girl reported that Theodore Miller was in the left corner. Smiling, Mia froze in one position. The girl stated that Mia Gluco was in the right corner. Throwing the golden amulet into the air, she prepared to announce the start of the fight. Looking at the guys who had taken fighting stances, she announced the start of the match. Having created many magical projectiles, Mia rushed into battle. Smirking, she stated that she was not going to drag out the battle, asking the main character not to pull the cat by the tail. With her hands out in front, Mia used an ice punch. Screaming, she said that she wanted to quickly send Theodore home, ordering him not to evade. Having parried Gluco's attack, the main character prepared to strike back. His hand was enveloped in a stream of powerful aura. Stretching his hand forward, Theodore activated a shockwave. A huge magical barrier appeared in front of his face. Raising his tie, the protagonist used ignition. Mia was shocked by the technology flying towards her. Raising his palm, Theodore activated the lubricant. Suddenly, the place where Mia was standing turned into sand, making her unable to stand on her feet. With lightning speed, the main character rushed towards her. With a wave of his hand, Theodore used Wind Cut. Suddenly, the amulet that was on Gluco's neck began to crack. Lauren's face was covered with genuine surprise. Approaching Mia lying on the ground, the main character tried to find out what happened. With a look of disgust, he suggested that he should not fight at full strength. With an embarrassed expression on her face, Mia agreed with his words. Screaming, the girl announced that Theodore Miller was earning the first point. Raising his hand, the main character froze in one position. Indignant, Gluco suggested that Theodore lacked manners. Raising his finger, the main character tried to find out if she wanted more. Putting her hand to her face, in her thoughts, Gluco could not believe that it was lightning. Starting to activate the technique, Mia used an arc shield. Wary, the main character called Mithra. Finding herself in the shackles of Theodore's technology, Mia was shocked. Clenching his fist, the protagonist activated a chain of blows, after which, with colossal power, many magical projectiles headed towards Gluco. Her magical barrier gradually began to crack, causing her to be surprised. The amulet that was on Gluco's neck flew back. Taken aback, Theodore was amazed at Mia's self-confidence, noting that she was ostentatiously using her magic. With a serious expression on his face, Vince continued to watch the fight. Continuing to think, the main character noted that even if she were not from a wealthy family that could financially support her, Mia is, without a doubt, a magician without talent. Many people watched as a grinning Mia was able to defeat one of her opponents. In his thoughts, Vince was sure that the only thing this child needed was discipline. Continuing to think, he said that the fame of the family had clouded her mind. All her life she had heard only praise and sweet speeches. Also, Vince noted that her combat experience should be hardly more serious than bullying the guards. Looking into the void, Vince thought that the experience that Theodore gained on the journey was special, saying that he had been in a life and death battle, which is why he knows what a real battle is. Taking hold of the amulet, Mia stated that the main character had already broken 2 crystals, noting that she could not even get close to his, asking if this was possible. With tears in her eyes, Gluco said that her daddy didn't tell her what to do in such a situation, saying that she was attacked and she didn't even really mind, asking if it was strange. Frightened, the main character asked her for forgiveness, asking if he had hurt her head. Smirking, Theodore noted that she had a lot of confidence, asking if she was now pressing for pity. The main character wondered if she really thought he would fall for it. Turning away, Mia said that everything was wrong. Lauren's face was filled with surprise. Confused, Gluco said that she was completely honest. Preparing for the attack, she stated that this was the first time in her life calling the main character a hillbilly who did not know any manners. By creating a wave of frost around herself, Mia ordered him to die. Taken aback, Theodore reported that she was moving too slowly. With a grin on her face, Gluco thought that no matter the speed, if he got caught, he would be finished. Bending down, Mia prepared to strike. Raising his hand to his face, Theodore used a layered shield. Gluco's head adhered to the main character's barrier. Due to the unimaginable power, Mia managed to break through it, finding herself inside. Due to the developed speed, she was unable to stay on her feet, as a result of which she fell to the ground. Falling face down on the ground, Mia froze in one position. Turning around, the main character said that the barrier had 4 protective layers, noting that she was able to break through all of them. Clenching her fist, Gluco called him a pathetic worm. With tears in her eyes, she talked about her face. With a shocked expression on her face, the girl announced that Theodore Miller was the winner. Taken aback, the main character noted that he did not want to make her cry. Hugging Gluco, Lauren said that next time she would be lucky. Approaching Theodore, the girl congratulated him on his victory. The main character noted that he does not feel like a winner. Holding many amulets in her hands, the girl said that he could think about it later, adding that Mia's 4 member tokens were now his. Having placed the award in Theodore's hands, the girl asked him not to forget that if lost, he must return it at his own expense. Looking at his reward, the protagonist's face was enveloped in a smile. After Vince took a break from reading the book, he tried to find out if the job was done. Slamming the book shut, he inquired about the results. Smirking, Vince wondered if Theodore thought it was all too easy. The main character stated that this was a trivial matter. Putting the book aside, Vince said that this is called a difference in experience, noting that Theodore has Alfred's memory and experience in battles, which is why he has the knowledge of a battle mage. Thus, Vince wanted to say that the main character is very different from the local students, who are like flowers from a greenhouse. Approaching Vince, the unknown person said that everything was exactly like that, saying that this tournament had always been called natural selection. Vince was shocked by what he saw. His gaze fell on the man, whose face was shrouded in a smile. Holding his glasses, Vince wondered what a busy man like him had forgotten in such a place. Horrified in his thoughts, Theodore wondered if this was really a magician in front of him and not a heavy swordsman. Laughing, the man asked if this was not too gloomy a greeting after so many years of separation. After which, Vince asked him not to hit him with all his might, noting that it hurt him. Smirking, the man asked him not to be dramatic, asking him to introduce the student he had brought. With an excited expression on his face, Vince agreed to his request. Approaching the alarmed protagonist, Vince said that this was his student, calling his name, noting that among many students at Bergen Academy, he supported him. After greeting, Theodore told about his name, saying that he was glad to meet you. Laughing and calling the main character a cutie, the man said that he looked innocent. After which, being wary, he froze in one position. Approaching the stunned Theodore, the man began to examine him in every possible way. Smirking, he said that no matter how naive the main character may seem, he looks like he went through a lot of difficulties, asking if Vince picked him up from the battlefield. The man noted that he would not dare to call Theodore a milksucker. Turning around, the main character tried to find out who it was. Lowering his gaze, Vince stated that the man might seem like a rude old man with no way of choosing expressions, noting that he was in fact the Archmage of the Blue Tower, Sir Blundell Underranks. Turning his head towards Vince, the main character said that he understood him. Turning his attention back to the grinning Blundell, indignant, Theodore asked if he was the Lord of the Blue Tower. The plot demonstrated 4 main elements. In the 4 large towers that protect the kingdom of Melter, the ranks of the mages belonging to them are divided into 5 levels. A magic staff was visible in the young man's hands. A beginner who has just entered the tower is basic. The grinning girl's gaze was covered by a red hat. Magicians with experience and a list of merits are average. Staring into space, Vince was lost in thought. Talented, having a ton of achievements, the highest. The stranger's face was shrouded in a mask. Veterans, who are considered the elders of the tower, are great. Turning around, the girl froze in one position. And finally, the sages, recognized as the owners of the tower, the Supreme One. Horrified, the main character thought that in front of him was the chief magician of the Supreme class, the supreme owner of the Blue Tower. Bowing, Theodore announced that he was a 3rd-year student at Bergen Academy, greeting the master of the Blue Tower. Blundell said there was no need for formality. Smirking, he noted that it was inappropriate for a man to walk with his head bowed, asking Vince if that was so. Putting his hand to his face, Vince wondered if something had happened. With a serious expression on his face, Blundell declared that they needed to stop having fun. Smirking, he said that everything was fine, noting that Vince had not been here for a long time, adding that it was for this reason that he was surprised at his return. Looking at Theodore, Blundell noted that he was also with a student, wondering how not to be curious in such a situation. Putting his hand to his face, an alarmed Vince stated that he could see the rapid impact of the rumors. Lost in thought, Blundell again began to examine the protagonist. Raising his finger, he stated that the more he looked, the more he wanted Theodore for himself, noting that if he hadn't met his own, he would definitely have taken him on as his apprentice. The main character stated that he could not do this even if he wanted to. Putting his hand to his chin, Vince asked Blundell to repeat what he had said, suggesting that he, too, had a student. Smiling, the Supreme Magician of the Blue Tower asked him not to be surprised, said that Vince's student was good, adding that the winner this year was obvious. Turning his head, Vince wondered what this meant. Suddenly, he was interrupted by the voice of a girl who reported about the 4th stadium, where the battle between Marcus Giovanni and Sylvia ended. Frozen in one position, the main character heard the girl say that after 24 seconds of the fight, participant Sylvia snatched victory. With an alarmed expression on his face, in his thoughts, Theodore was extremely surprised by the results of the fight. Continuing to think, he noted that even if you give it your all from the very beginning, it is a difficult task. Blundell's face curled into a grin. The main character was sure that the difference in strength was enormous. Horrified, he wondered what kind of monster this was. On Sylvia's shoulder was a cane, which was covered with many amulets. Due to powerful wind currents, Blundell's cloak fluttered from side to side. A shadow fell on his student's face. A hood was visible on her head. Leaning on her cane, Sylvia froze in one position. With a worried expression on his face, Theodore thought about her silver hair. With a serious expression on her face, Sylvia turned to her teacher. Smiling, Blundell was glad that she was back. Embarrassed, Sylvia managed to escape from his hands. With a cry, Blundell asked her to come forward, adding that he wanted to introduce her to someone. A look of surprise appeared on Sylvia's face. Then, turning around, she headed towards Blundell. Putting his hand on Sylvia's shoulder, Blundell asked for forgiveness for the delay and said that this cold-blooded girl was Sylvia, his student, whom he had raised in secret from everyone for a long time. After which, the main character locked eyes with her. With a worried expression on his face, Theodore thought about the extrasensory perception he had gained from absorbing Alfred's experience, which told him that this seemingly innocent girl was stronger than the hobgoblin boss. Clutching the cane in her hand, Sylvia froze in one position. Grinning, Blundell suggested that the boys were curious about her. Turning to them, Blundell wondered if they wanted to test Sylvia, noting that this was a good opportunity to show her their strong side. Looking at Theodore, Sylvia waited for his answer. The protagonist's face was clouded with doubt. Bowing, he apologized, saying that he was refusing, suggesting that now he could only show his weak side. Putting his hand to his chin, Blundell said he was sorry to hear that. After saying goodbye to the guys, he noted that in this case, they would leave this for later, asking Sylvia to go with him. After which, Blundell and his student headed to the arena. Baring his teeth, Theodore turned his head. Moving away from Vince, the main character froze in one position. Putting his hand to his face, Vince said that there were ways to win while avoiding Sylvia. Theodore stated that he knew about this, adding that it would be easier that way. Bowing his head, the main character said that he admires magicians like Sylvia. Then, placing his cloak on his shoulder, Theodore turned towards Vince. With his hand on his side, the protagonist stated that this was the reason he wanted to take on this challenge. A smile appeared on his face. Hair caught behind Vince's glasses covered his eyes. Closing his eyes, he was lost in his own thoughts. Adjusting his glasses, Vince noted that if he were in his right mind, he would not agree. Smirking, he stated that after so much time, his blood was boiling again. Speaking to Blundell, whom he called a raccoon-like old man, Vince said that he wanted to see how shame would chill him to the bone. Smiling, the protagonist stated that it sounded great, noting that he would take a look at it too. With his hands on his side, Vince noted that the first thing they needed to do was go to all the artifact shops and bookstores, saying that if Theodore liked something, he just needed to tell him about it. The main character's face was covered with genuine joy. Running up to Vince, he set off with him on the road. Leaning on her arm, the girl noted that many tourists were leaning in this place, saying that only a couple of onlookers passing by came to see her. Looking out the window, she said that they too ran away as soon as they heard the prices. Lowering her gaze, the girl said that she could not sell even the highest quality artifacts. Turning towards the window, she wondered what that sweet smell of money was. Her gaze fell on Vince, who opened the store door. Surprised, the girl thought that he belonged to the Red Tower, noting his highest class. Putting his hand on the table, Vince froze in one position. Looking at the alarmed girl, Vince asked her to show her best product, telling her that price did not matter. After which, taking out a large chest from the depths of the shop, the girl provided the contents to the guys. Grinning, she declared that it was the best she had. Putting his hand to her chin, Vince reminded her of the words that price doesn't matter, asking if that was true. Taken aback, the girl said that the best thing in the store was here. With a distraught look, Vince stated that this was not the case, noting that she must have B-rank items, asking her to bring everything. While looking for a special product, the girl said that as the High Magician of the Red Tower, Vince has the right to this purchase. Taking out a mysterious chest, she said that it was there. A magical artifact appeared before the guy's eyes, which resembled a glove. Turning to Theodore, Vince asked for an assessment. Placing his hand on the magical artifact, the main character applied the assessment. Looking at the magical artifact, the system notified that it was a Western wind protection armor made from mithril alloy by a certain dwarf, noting that it was good in itself, but it was best to apply magical engraving to the glove. Further, she said that using the powers of the owner, the magical artifact casts wind magic, and the airflow it creates reflects enemy projectiles, reporting rumors that say that long ago the owner of this glove easily broke through showers of arrows from elite archers. The system stated that the glove's class is precious, noting that when absorbing the item, the mastery of defensive wind magic increases, reporting that when used, Yushi's patronage is activated. Surprised while in his thoughts, the protagonist thought that it was a B-rank precious item, stating that it was at the same level as the Roaring Fire. Leaning on her hands, the girl said that it costs 180 gold, noting that there is a discount for people with an invitation, adding that with it she will give it for only 144 gold. After which, Vince put a gold bar on the table. Looking at the shocked girl, he stated that he would pay the full amount, asking if there were any other necessary procedures. Grabbing her face, she said that this was not so, adding that nothing more was needed. Smirking, Vince said that in that case, he would take it. The Magician of the Red Tower put a magical artifact in his mysterious bag. After which, a huge cloud of dust appeared in the store. Putting his bag on his shoulder, Vince informed Theodore that they needed to go to the next store. Taken aback, the girl thanked Vince for the purchase. Leaning on the wooden partition, in his thoughts, the main character wondered how much money Professor Vince had already spent, declaring that he was definitely not a magician of the Red Tower, but a wallet killer. Sitting down on a chair, Vince asked Theodore to absorb the rare items first, suggesting that this would whet the appetite for the magical grimoire. Taking one of the magical artifacts in his hands, the main character agreed to his request. Stretching his hand forward to Gluttony, Theodore announced that it was time to eat. The magical grimoire noted that it had been waiting for this for a long time, after which, using his tongue, he grabbed one of the magical artifacts. A huge number of artifacts were visible on the tongue, the absorption of which was reported by the system. The main character's face was shocked. Turning towards Theodore, Vince stated that absorbing artifacts and increasing power alone was not enough, noting that if he wanted to reach the fourth circle, then he needed to absorb knowledge as well. Smirking, Vince said that now it was time for Theodore's favorite pastime. From what he heard, the protagonist's face was shrouded in bewilderment. Taking out the book, Vince noted that he was talking about reading. After which, concentrating, Theodore began to study the book. Looking at the mysterious spot that appeared on his chest, the main character told about the fourth circle. A magical seal appeared on his heart. Wary, Theodore thought that his heart was beginning to boil a little. Suddenly, the main character's face was shrouded in genuine surprise. Adjusting his glasses, Vince tried to find out if the fourth lap had already been completed. Extending his hand, he congratulated Theodore, noting that now that he had become a full-fledged magician, he would be able to follow his path, asking him not to forget this truth and continue his path without doubt. Smiling, the main character said that he would try. Tying the magic bag, Vince assumed that the takeover was over. Clenching his fist, he invited Theodore to proceed to the precious items. After which, he dumped a lot of magical artifacts on the table. Looking at the contents lying on the table, the main character could not believe that he would absorb such amazing artifacts, noting that these were not even cheap things, but precious things. Turning his attention to the alarmed Theodore, Vince asked him not to hesitate. Clasping his hands, he stated that if there are means, then the main character needs to use them, noting that once he decides, he can no longer be stopped. With a serious expression on his face, Vince tried to find out if Theodore wanted to defeat Sylvia. Closing his eyes, the main character was lost in his thoughts. Encouraged, he declared that he understood it. Stretching out his hand, which contained the magical grimoire, he asked it to absorb everything. Putting his hand on his head, turning to Theodore, Vince said that today he would have individual lessons with him. Stuffing his hands into his pockets, he explained that Sylvia specialized in water-type magic, and the biggest advantage of such magic was its versatility. The sun's rays were breaking through the thick crown of the tree. Next, Vince talked about a cloud in the sky, saying that it was water. Having talked about rivers running along the earth, he said that this is also water. Reporting on the permafrost that is located at the peak of the mountain, Vince noted that this is also water. After talking about the fog that covers everything in the early morning, he also said that it was water. Raising his finger, Vince spoke about the freedom to choose between solid, liquid, and gas, as well as the soul and flesh of water magic, noting that it cannot be found in particular weakness, adding that it is not the best at anything. Putting his hand to his chin, the protagonist stated that she was ambiguous. Smirking, Vince noted that this was just a guess, suggesting that Theodore avoid close combat with Sylvia. Lundell had a cane on his back. Vince asked if the main character remembered the stick that the boss of the Blue Tower carries with him, telling about the impressive wooden cane. Realizing his hand, Theodore reported that he remembered it, noting that it was quite healthy for a staff. Taking hold of the hem of his shirt, Vince noted that it was not a staff, stating that, as the main character had already noted, it was a club. Gripping the weapon with both hands, Blundell prepared to attack. Vince said that the old man went to one eastern corner and learned to use it in battles, just as a hobby, adding that now he masterfully wields it, noting that he crushed many knights' heads on the battlefield. Laughing, Theodore said that he remembered that Sylvia also had one. Remembering the image of Blundell's student, the protagonist's face was shrouded in genuine fear and excitement. Approaching him, Vince informed him that he simply did not need to approach her. Forming huge drops of water in his hand, Vince asked them to stop chatting. Having created a powerful stream of water, he declared that they should start training. Professor Vince, dressed in a white shirt and light trousers, stood in the bright blue light with a hostile expression on his face. The main character, standing at a great distance from Vince, flinched and put his palm out in front of him when the professor sharply threw his hand into the air, attacking the student. Theodore dodged the first attack and the subsequent ones, and then turned around and began to run very quickly, grinning from tension. When one of the professor's attacks had almost overtaken the main character, he raised his palm, from which a bright glow emanated. Theodore fell to the floor and a small shield formed around him, through which Vince's magic could not pass. The professor, standing half-turned, put his hands in his trouser pockets and began to silently watch as Theodore rose from the floor with renewed vigor. With a smile, Vince took one hand out of his pocket, above which a diamond was shining, and suggested that the main character increase the load a little, because he had a good reaction. Theodore, wiping drops of sweat from his chin with the back of his hand, remained silent and looked warily at the professor. Finally, the last day of the student tournament arrived. The main character sat with his palms on his knees and breathing heavily with his eyes wide open, his brows furrowed and his face wet with sweat. While Theodore slowly rose from the floor, Vince stood in front of him with his legs wide apart and his hands in his pockets, saying that he would not want to let the main character into this fight until his skills reached the required level, even if he had to live with the fact that the main character, the hero, will hate him. Theodore hesitantly asked Vince if that meant he passed. The professor chuckled and rubbed his chin with his palm, answering that the main character passed with a perfect result. In the waiting room of the Pentarium there was a long table where some of the young people from the large tournament crowd were eating. Sylvia was in first place with 95 points, Pagani Vilgast was in second place with 21 points, and Rovasdane was in third place with 18 points. When a contestant in a black and blue cloak with a hood pulled over his head was surprised at 95 points. A girl with long pink hair and a dress of the same color assumed that Sylvia was not allowing others to collect tokens, since second place had much less points than first. The girl arched her eyebrows and summed up that this was expected from a disciple of the Lord of the Blue Tower. Sylvia sat at the far end of the dining table. Blundell, resting his elbow on the table, said that at first there were those who attacked Sylvia with at least some desire, but recently the opponents had abandoned this idea. When Blundell asked if young people today were spineless, the girl curtly agreed, eating a loaf of bread. Blundell suddenly turned around and frowned thoughtfully as a man dressed in black approached him. Theodore bowed and greeted the Lord of the Blue Tower, and Blundell recognized the youth as Vince's student. The protagonist smiled softly and said that he was honored that Blundell remembered his name. Sylvia did not pay any attention to the main character and continued to chew a loaf of bread. Theodore reacted to the girl's behavior with a face full of hostility. The main character thoughtfully squeezed his cheeks when he realized that he no longer felt the same tension as before, which made him think that he had become a little stronger, and now he would definitely cope. Blundell, with a wide smile and a friendly gesture, sincerely congratulated Theodore for having so successfully reached the fourth circle in such a short time, and the protagonist sheepishly thanked the man. Blundell then pointed his palm at Sylvia and said that Theodore seemed to have come here because he was interested in this girl. Sylvia turned to look at the young man in black clothes, who clenched his hands into fists. Not a single emotion appeared on the girl's face when Theodore officially challenged her to a match in a student tournament. Sylvia looked at the protagonist with confusion on her face, as if she wasn't sure Theodore could handle someone like her. The main character explained with a smile that he needed those 95 tokens Sylvia had collected, since he only had 5. The main character grinned contentedly and added that the rule of the tournament states that the one who occupies the leading place cannot refuse the opponent. Sylvia, raising the bread to her lips, quietly replied that she would not refuse. Blundell watched the conversation with a frown, and Sylvia planted her palms on the table and rose from her chair. The girl looked at Theodore and coldly stated that she was thinking of pocketing 5 more tokens to get 100. The room was torn apart by the enthusiastic screams of those present, who could not contain their emotions that someone had challenged the leader of the tournament. When a young man with golden eyes and gray hair laughed with an evil grin and said that Theodore sounded like an arrogant boy, the shorter young man furrowed his brows and replied that the tournament would end in just 2 hours. A deafening cry rang through the spacious, bright arena, announcing its opening, where the final battle was coming. Students in cloaks and witch hats took their seats in the stands and discussed that Lord Blue Tower's student was participating this year, and they hoped it would be a worthwhile spectacle. A young man in green clothes and a brown mustache raised one eyebrow in surprise, not understanding how Theodore even managed to get all the way to the finals. And a man with blonde hair shared this opinion and responded with a laugh that the loser in this fight had already been determined. The spectators jumped out of their seats when Sylvia entered the arena wearing a recognizable light blue cloak and holding a long wooden staff. While Sylvia walked to the center of the arena with a straight face, the audience was talking about Theodore's opponent being the favorite of the Lord of the Blue Tower. Theodore clenched his hands into fists and was silently indignant that there were so many spectators. The main character raised his fists and found himself beginning to worry about the fact that such a crowd was watching him. Theodore put his hands in his pockets and suddenly realized that, on the other hand, this was exactly what he wanted. The main character wrapped his fingers around the yellow tie and came to the conclusion that this is where he will show himself. Theodore walked confidently into the arena, clenching his fists tightly. Vince, dressed in red and white, approached Blundell wearing a blue fur vest with a smile. Blundell, standing with his arms crossed, smiled as Vince politely invited the man to join him. The Lord of the Blue Tower immediately agreed to Vince's proposal. The professor walked closer to Blundell, and he rested his hands on the stone balcony, looking at Vince. Blundell recited the Red Tower's motto with a grin: "If you can win a fight, victory is yours, and if you can't win, find another way to win." When Vince was surprised that Blundell remembered this motto, the Lord of the Blue Tower responded with a laugh that the Lord of the Red Tower always goes on and on about it. Blundell rested his head on his palm and raised one eyebrow, asking if Vince had any appreciation for Theodore's abilities, referring to his chances of winning against Sylvia. Vince brought his eyebrows to the bridge of his nose and answered with a smile that there was no point in discussing this. The professor squinted at Blundell through his red glasses and answered mysteriously that it was better to just watch to see who would emerge victorious. The center of the arena was filled with blinding light. A girl with long brown hair and a large light hat happily clenched her hands into fists, loudly announcing the final of the student tournament. The audience was introduced to Sylvia, whose yellow-blue cloak and white hair fluttered in the wind. Then Theodore's name was loudly called as he took off his black jacket and held it on one shoulder. The presenter raised her palm up, releasing a bright flash high into the sky. Sylvia looked at Theodore with determination in her eyes, holding the staff in front of her. The main character covered his face with his open palm, looking at his opponent, and the presenter loudly announced that the battle begins now. The presenter loudly ordered the fight to begin. but for some time Theodore and Sylvia stood motionless and continued to look at each other. The main character, covering his mouth with his hand, thought that he had analyzed all of Sylvia's matches and came to the conclusion that her speed of casting spells was unusually high. Theodore furrowed his thin eyebrows and created flames in his palms, thinking that it would all be over for him if he missed the moment. The main character used a double projectile of fire, and the entire space around the young man was filled with thick, bright red fiery fog. Sylvia did not move and stared blankly at her opponent as her cloak and hair blew in the wind. Theodore, frowning and grinning, ordered the force of the storm to strike as it should. The main character used the power of the storm and directed a stream of scorching flames at the enemy. When the fire approached Sylvia, she was not at all confused and put the wooden staff in front of her. Theodore, engulfed in his own flames, thought that his magic combined speed and crushing power, and this cannot be stopped by the pitiful protection of water magic. Sylvia brought the staff closer to her face and sighed with a small smile. Theodore crossed his arms in front of him as a powerful fiery explosion thundered through the arena, through which it was impossible to see anything. The main character, standing on his legs bent wide apart, bent over as thick black smoke rushed towards him. Some spectators began to get angry, while others opened their mouths in shock. Through the thick smoke that filled the space, the black silhouette of the main character was visible. Theodore touched his chin with his fist and concluded that the smoke was hiding Sylvia from him. The main character, covering his nose and mouth with his hand, frowned and used the eye of the hawk, and the outline of his pupils immediately became lighter. Theodore still couldn't make out Sylvia's silhouette among the gray smoke. The main character, clenching his fists, assumed that he had hit the girl, because he still used a whole series of accelerated fire projectiles. Theodore frowned and thought about the temperature. The main character read in a book that the lower the temperature, the stronger the ice. Theodore deduced that Sylvia was building a barrier, lowering her temperature to withstand the heat. Suddenly, among the smoke, Sylvia appeared, standing with her staff raised high in her hand. The girl struck the ground with her wooden staff, and a thin, bright blue haze appeared in the air around her, and her clothes and hair rose up due to the wind. Theodore's face showed surprise when he recognized this as fourth circle water magic. Theodore froze in fear when he saw a large water serpent above him. Sylvia swung her wooden staff sharply. When the girl cut the air with her weapon, her water attacks rushed towards Theodore with lightning speed. The main character stood with his mouth open in horror as several of Sylvia's powerful attacks quickly approached him. Theodore jumped and crossed his arms in front of him as the water magic hit the ground and sent up columns of dust and dirt. The water serpent continued to pursue the fleeing protagonist. Sylvia's attacks caught Theodore again, and he, jumping away from them, already doubted that this was a fourth circle spell. The main character, holding his arms crossed, shouted loudly, creating a shield for himself. The entire space of the arena was filled with Sylvia's bright blue magical attacks. Theodore deftly moved between the water currents, leaving behind a bright yellow light in the air. The main character was amazed at the speed of his rival's attacks and concluded that he would be in trouble if Sylvia ever hit the target, but Theodore understood that there was no point in simply dodging the attacks. The main character frowned and turned around, deciding to use a different tactic. Theodore decided to target the source of the attack, Sylvia, and in the next moment found himself in front of the girl. The water serpent, its mouth open, rushed towards Theodore as he flew towards the ground. When the protagonist tried to approach Sylvia, the two were separated by a powerful stream of water magic, and Theodore was sent flying back. The main character made a dissatisfied sound when he landed at a great distance from his opponent. Professor Vince, watching the fight, was in awe of Sylvia's abilities. Blundell replied with a grin that fire and lightning were nothing compared to a water serpent, and asked Vince what he was up to. The professor smiled mysteriously in response, without taking his green eyes off the fight. Vince concluded that his answer would be revealed by Theodore placing his palm on the ground and clenching his other palm into a fist. The main character furrowed his eyebrows and narrowed his eyes, bringing his fist to his lips. The next moment, the water snake collided with a bright yellow flash with a loud sound. Dodging the water streams, Theodore thought that the fire magic of the fourth circle would neutralize the water serpent, but the main character cannot reveal his trump card so early. While running away from the water kite, the main character concluded that there was a second option, which was to take a free shot. Theodore thought that now that he had reached the fourth circle, there were 3 or 4 seals available to him. When Sylvia's attacks loomed over the main character, he firmly decided that right now he needed to immobilize the water serpent. The water serpent attacked Theodore, and he pushed off the ground with his feet, releasing magic from his palms. The main character loudly called Mithra, who immediately appeared next to him and ordered the spirit of the earth to strike without mercy. The water serpent did not stop hunting for the main character, its mouth opened predatorily with sharp fangs. Sylvia's attacks destroyed the surface of the arena, creating a deafening explosion. Theodore, exhaling loudly, covered his face with his hands to protect himself from the dense smoke that rose. Suddenly, among the gray smoke, a bright flash of light appeared. Theodore folded his palms, aiming at Sylvia standing in the distance. The main character is glad that he can see everything, but the water snake blocks the view, so Sylvia does not see Theodore. The main character arched his eyebrows and bared his teeth, releasing a dazzling bright yellow magical stream from his palms. Sylvia stood motionless as a free shot approached her, passing through the dense smoke. A bright magical stream appeared directly in front of the girl, who created a transparent shield around herself. Sylvia's blue eyes widened in amazement as her magical barrier cracked from the free shot. The next second, Theodore's attack caught up with the girl, and she was thrown into the air. Sylvia opened her mouth and gripped her staff tighter between both palms as the triangular badge on her cloak cracked and lost fragments. There were two smoky fogs in the arena, located opposite each other. Theodore stood on bent legs with folded palms, his head bowed exhaustedly. The girl in the big light hat wanted to say something, but stopped short, frozen with an expression of shock on her face. The main character, down on one knee, looked smugly at Sylvia while the presenter loudly announced that the main character had received the first point. Theodore broke out into a joyful smile when he thought that he would get the other 2 points without any problems if he continued in the same spirit.